The alarms tore through the palace before I even understood what they meant. I was standing in the middle of the grand hall, wearing the ceremonial blue robes of the Thal Dominion, when the doors at the far end burst open, and 3 armed strangers walked in like they owned the place. My guards froze. My father's advisors froze. Everyone froze, because nobody expected an attack tonight, of all nights, during the Peace Gala, meant to celebrate 10 years of calm between our people and the Corveth ascendancy. I turned to look for my husband, Ethan, expecting to see the same fear on his face that I felt twisting in my chest. Instead, I found him standing very still, watching the strangers with an expression I had never seen on him before. Calm, focused, almost bored, the way a man looks when he already knows exactly how something is going to end. I had married Ethan 2 years earlier, and in all that time, I never once thought of him as anything more than a kind, quiet man from a distant, primitive world called Earth. He cooked simple meals. He apologized too much. He never raised his voice, not even when the nobles mocked him behind cupped hands, calling him the primitive prince, the pity groom, the soft little human the Dominion had married off to a princess out of politeness rather than respect. I believed all of it too, for a long time. I believed my husband was ordinary. I was wrong, and that night I would learn exactly how wrong. The strangers wore Corveth combat gear, dark gray plating with a crimson stripe across the chest, and they moved with the practiced ease of soldiers who expected no resistance. Their leader, a tall Corveth officer with pale ridged skin, raised a hand and spoke in a flat, mocking tone. "Princess Vela Jaren Thal," he said, letting my full name roll off his tongue like an insult. "We only came to remind your father that the Dominion's strength is an illusion. Nothing more. No one needs to be hurt tonight unless someone forces our hand." My guards reached for their weapons, but the Corveth soldiers were faster and better trained, and within seconds, 3 of my own guards were disarmed and pinned against the marble floor. The hall filled with gasps. Nobles scattered toward the walls. My mother grabbed my arm, pulling me back, but I couldn't move. I was staring at Ethan. He hadn't moved an inch. He hadn't reached for a weapon. He hadn't even looked afraid. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice shaking, "we need to get out of here." He glanced at me, just for a second, and something in his eyes had changed. The soft, apologetic warmth I knew so well was gone, replaced by something sharper, something that made my skin prickle with a feeling I couldn't name yet. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. "Please." I almost laughed, despite the fear choking my throat. Stay behind him. My husband, who once apologized for accidentally stepping on my foot during a dance, who once spent an entire evening nervously trying to remember which fork belonged to which course during a Dominion dinner, was telling me to stay behind him like he was the one protecting me. The Corveth officer noticed him too, finally, and let out a short, amused breath. "And who is this?" he said, looking Ethan up and down with open contempt. "The human husband. I heard stories about you, little liaison. They say you're harmless. A soft little pet the princess keeps around for show." The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the palace's shield generators outside. Ethan tilted his head slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was calm in a way that somehow felt more dangerous than shouting ever could. "You should have done more research before walking in here," he said. The officer laughed, a short, ugly sound, and gestured for his soldiers to move forward and secure the room. That was the moment everything changed. The moment my entire understanding of my husband shattered and rebuilt itself in the space of a few heartbeats. Ethan moved before the nearest soldier could even lift his weapon fully. It wasn't a display of strength like the warriors of my own world showed in the training arenas, all roaring challenges and heavy armored strikes. It was quiet and precise, and almost gentle in its economy, every motion measured, every step placed exactly where it needed to be. He redirected the soldier's arm, took the weapon from his grip with barely any resistance, and had the man disarmed and off balance before anyone in the hall fully understood what had happened. A second soldier turned toward him, and Ethan was already moving again, closing the distance instead of retreating, using the confusion of the moment like a tool. I had seen combat drills before, formal, ceremonial, choreographed things meant to look impressive at festivals. This was nothing like that. This was fast, economical, almost invisible in how little wasted motion there was. Within moments, both soldiers were disarmed, their weapons now in Ethan's hands, and the third soldier hesitated, glancing toward his officer for direction. The confidence in the room had shifted entirely, and it had shifted around one quiet, unassuming man that everyone had underestimated for 2 years. The Corvith officer's amusement drained from his face. "Impossible," he muttered. "You're a diplomat, a liaison. Not a soldier." Ethan straightened, holding one of the confiscated weapons loosely at his side, not aiming it, just holding it, the way someone holds a tool they know exactly how to use if they need to. "I was a soldier long before I was a diplomat," he said. "Earth doesn't send its ordinary people into space, not when survival depends on being ready for exactly this kind of moment." I stood frozen, staring at him, at this man I thought I knew completely. I remembered small things now, things I had dismissed without a second thought. The way he always positioned himself near exits in unfamiliar rooms. The way his eyes tracked every person who entered a space, cataloging them without seeming to. The scar along his forearm that he once brushed off as a childhood accident. The calm, unreadable stillness that settled over him whenever tension rose in a room, which I had always mistaken for simple patience. None of it had been an accident. None of it had been ordinary. The Corveth officer took a step back, his confidence cracking further, and barked an order to his remaining soldier, something sharp and urgent in his own language. The soldier hesitated, torn between following orders and the sudden realization that this mission had gone very wrong very quickly. "Lower your weapon," Ethan said to the officer, his voice steady, almost patient. "This doesn't need to go any further. Nobody in this room has to get hurt tonight." That's still true, but only if you make the right choice in the next few seconds. For a long moment, nobody moved. The hall was silent except for distant shouting from the corridor outside, where more of my guards were finally rushing toward the disturbance, alerted far too late to be the ones who mattered in this moment. The officer's hand tightened around his weapon, and I felt my heart lurch, terrified that he would do something reckless, something that would end in pain for someone I loved. But Ethan didn't flinch. He held his ground, calm and immovable, like a man who had faced far worse than one desperate officer in a crumbling plan. "You're outnumbered," the officer said, though his voice wavered slightly. "There are more of us outside." "There were," Ethan said simply. "Your extraction team was intercepted the moment they tried to breach the outer perimeter. I made sure of that before this gala even started, because I don't attend events without checking who else might be interested in crashing them." The officer's face went pale, the ridges along his skin darkening with what I now recognized as fear. "You knew," he said. "You knew we were coming." "I suspected," Ethan corrected. "Your people have been probing Dominion border colonies for months, testing response times, testing resolve. It wasn't hard to guess you'd eventually try something closer to the capital, somewhere symbolic. A gala celebrating peace was too perfect a target to resist." I found my voice finally, though it came out smaller than I intended. "You knew about this and you didn't tell me?" Ethan didn't take his eyes off the officer, but his voice softened slightly when he answered me. "I didn't want to frighten you over a suspicion that might have been wrong," he said. "I'm sorry. I should have trusted you with it. We'll talk about that later, I promise, but right now, I need you to trust me for just a little longer." The officer, sensing the shifting tide of the room, made his decision. He lunged, not toward Ethan, but toward me, perhaps hoping to use me as leverage, to turn the situation back in his favor through fear rather than force. It was a desperate, foolish choice, and Ethan was already moving before the officer's foot left the ground. What happened next took only seconds, but it felt like it stretched across an eternity. Ethan intercepted him cleanly, redirecting his momentum away from me with a controlled, almost effortless motion, disarming him fully and pinning him against the cold marble floor without a single unnecessary movement. It wasn't brutal, it wasn't cruel, it was simply final, the kind of ending that comes from absolute confidence rather than anger. The remaining soldier, seeing his officer subdued and his mission collapsed entirely, dropped his weapon and raised his hands, surrendering without another word. The hall erupted into motion after that, guards finally flooding in, securing the intruders, tending to the shaken guests, restoring some semblance of order to what had been, only minutes earlier, one of the most terrifying moments of my life. My father's voice rang out somewhere behind me, giving orders, demanding explanations, but I barely heard any of it. I was still looking at Ethan. He rose slowly from where he had pinned the officer, letting the palace guards take over securing the man, and turned toward me. The sharp, focused stranger I had glimpsed only minutes ago began to soften again, the familiar warmth returning to his eyes, though something in his posture remained different now, like a mask had been permanently lifted and could never quite be put back on the same way. "Are you all right?" he asked, closing the distance between us, his hands hovering near my shoulders, as if he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch me yet, not after everything I had just seen. I didn't answer right away. I was too busy trying to reconcile two versions of the same man in my mind, the gentle, apologetic husband I had spent 2 years quietly pitying, and the calm, capable soldier who had just dismantled an assassination attempt without raising his voice. "Who are you?" I finally asked, and I meant it as a real question, not an accusation. Ethan let out a slow breath, glancing around at the chaos still settling in the hall, at the guards leading away the captured Corvette soldiers, at the nobles whispering urgently to one another, as they finally allowed themselves to feel the fear they had been too stunned to feel moments earlier. "I'm still the same person I've always been," he said quietly. "I just never told you everything about where I came from, or what I did before I met you." He led me toward a quieter corner of the hall, away from the worst of the commotion, and for the first time in 2 years of marriage, he began to tell me the truth. He told me about Earth, not the version presented in Dominion textbooks as a backwater world grateful for the Concord's charity, but the real Earth, a planet that had spent centuries fighting wars among itself before finally turning that same hard-earned discipline toward the stars. He told me about the Void Skirmishes, a conflict most of the galaxy barely acknowledged, where a small human fleet with limited resources had faced down a threat that should have crushed them, and had won through sheer stubbornness, adaptability, and a willingness to escalate faster than any enemy expected. He told me he had been a soldier in that conflict, young and untested at first, but hardened quickly by necessity. He told me that when Earth was offered a place in the Concord, humanity had made a quiet, deliberate choice to present itself as harmless, unremarkable, easily underestimated, because a species that hides its strength survives longer than one that flaunts it. "We learned a long time ago," he said, "that showing your full strength invites bigger threats. Staying quiet, staying humble, letting people assume you're harmless, that buys you time, time to prepare, time to protect the people you care about." "And I was one of those people," I said slowly, understanding beginning to settle over me. "You married me, and you kept pretending, even with me. At first it was policy," he admitted. "Earth wanted its representatives abroad to blend in, to avoid drawing attention, but that changed the longer I knew you. I wanted to tell you the truth so many times. I just didn't know how to explain it without you looking at me differently." I thought about that, about the quiet fear behind his words, the fear that revealing his real strength would somehow make him less like the gentle husband I had grown to love, and more like a stranger wearing a familiar face. "I don't look at you differently because you're strong," I told him, surprising myself with how certain I felt saying it. "I look at you differently because you thought you had to hide who you really were from me, even after everything we've shared." Ethan's expression softened, something vulnerable flickering across his face for just a moment, a crack in the composed soldier that had emerged only minutes earlier. "I'm sorry," he said again, and this time it felt different, heavier, more honest than any apology he had ever given me before. "I should have trusted you sooner." Before I could respond, my father approached, flanked by 2 guards and looking between us with an expression I had never seen him wear before, something between shock and grudging respect. "Liaison Hale," my father said carefully, using Ethan's formal title. "The captured officer is already talking. It seems tonight's attack was meant to test the Dominion's true strength, to see how vulnerable we've become in years of peace. It seems they severely underestimated one factor in their calculations." "They underestimated Earth," Ethan said simply. It happens more often than people expect. We've built an entire diplomatic strategy around it." My father studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, something shifting in his gaze, a new understanding settling into place. "Perhaps it's time the Dominion stopped underestimating your people as well," he said. Over the following days, the full scope of what had happened became clear. The Corveth Ascendancy's extraction team, the one meant to support the officer inside the palace, had indeed been intercepted before they ever reached the perimeter, exactly as Ethan had claimed. When Corveth Command received reports of what had truly happened during the gala, not a foolish, romanticized story of a soft human liaison somehow overpowering trained soldiers, but an accurate account of controlled, decisive, almost effortless combat, their aggressive probing of Dominion border colonies stopped almost entirely. Word spread quietly through diplomatic channels, the kind of information that moves faster than official statements ever could. Earth wasn't the backwater charity case the galaxy had assumed. It was a species that had chosen, deliberately and strategically, to appear harmless, while quietly maintaining the kind of readiness that could dismantle a coordinated attack without a single life lost. I began to see the Dominion court differently after that night as well. The same nobles who had once mocked Ethan behind cupped hands now went out of their way to greet him with careful respect, though I noticed he never seemed to enjoy the shift in attention. If anything, he seemed almost uncomfortable with it, preferring the quiet, easily dismissed version of himself that had let him move through the world without drawing unwanted attention. "You don't like this, do you?" I asked him one evening, several days after the attack, as we sat together on the balcony overlooking the palace gardens, the same gardens where he had once nervously asked my father for permission to court me, stumbling over Dominion customs he clearly hadn't fully understood at the time. "I never wanted to be seen as some kind of hidden weapon," he admitted. "I wanted to be seen as your husband, someone steady, someone you could rely on without needing to worry about what I might be capable of." "You can be both," I said, reaching for his hand. "I don't think those things cancel each other out." He was quiet for a moment, considering that, watching the twin moons rise slowly over the garden walls. "I used to think hiding my strength was the safest thing I could do," he said eventually. "For Earth and for myself. But maybe there's a difference between hiding who you are and simply choosing when to reveal it." I thought about everything that had changed since that night, not just in how the galaxy viewed Earth, but in how I viewed the man sitting beside me. I had married him, believing he was ordinary, unremarkable, a kind but unimpressive figure standing quietly in my shadow. I understood now how wrong that belief had been, not because he had suddenly become someone new, but because I was finally seeing the whole of who he had always been. "I think," I said slowly, "that the version of you who cooks simple meals and apologizes too much, and the version of you who disarmed 3 soldiers without raising his voice, are the same person. I don't think you were ever ordinary, Ethan. I think you were simply patient enough to wait until the moment mattered, before showing me why." He turned to look at me then, something warm and steady settling into his expression, the same quiet strength that had carried him through years of conflict long before I ever knew him, now sitting comfortably alongside the gentle husband I had fallen in love with. "For what it's worth," he said softly, "you were never ordinary to me either. Not for a single day." Below us, the palace gardens glowed faintly under the rising moons, quiet and peaceful once more, though I knew now that peace was never truly guaranteed, not for my people, and not for his. It was something built carefully, defended quietly, and sometimes protected by people the galaxy had made the mistake of underestimating. I had spent 2 years believing my husband was ordinary. I would spend the rest of my life understanding just how extraordinary he truly was, not because of what he had done that night in the Grand Hall, but because of everything he had chosen to become, long before I ever knew his name.